I need to give you some context before I dive into this story. I'm a sophomore at Arizona State, and like most college students, I'm always looking for ways to make some extra cash. My buddy Jake told me about this security job at an old office building downtown. The pay was decent, and all I had to do was sit at a desk from midnight to 8 a.m. and make sure nobody broke in. Easy money, right? The building itself was pretty standard, 12 floors of generic office space that used to house some insurance company before they moved operations to Phoenix. Most of the floors were completely empty now, just waiting for new tenants. The only occupied floor was the third one, where a small accounting firm still had their offices. My first few nights were exactly what you'd expect. I'd show up at midnight, do a quick walkthrough of the building, then spend the rest of my shift studying or watching Netflix on my phone. The building manager, Mr. Rodriguez, had given me this whole spiel about checking each floor every few hours, but honestly, I got lazy pretty quick. The elevator was slow as hell, and walking 12 flights of stairs wasn't exactly my idea of fun. Everything changed about 2 weeks into the job. I was sitting at the security desk around 3 a.m., cramming for a psych exam, when I heard the elevator ding. I looked up from my textbook, confused as hell. Nobody should be in the building at that hour, and I definitely hadn't seen anyone come through the main entrance. I figured maybe it was just the elevator malfunctioning. Old buildings do weird stuff sometimes. But then I heard footsteps above me. Not just any footsteps either. They were deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. The sound was coming from the fourth floor, which was supposed to be completely empty. My first instinct was to call Mr. Rodriguez, but it was 3 in the morning and I didn't want to wake him up over what might be nothing. Instead, I decided to check it out myself. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the elevator, my heart already starting to race a little. The fourth floor was pitch black when the elevator doors opened. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty cubicles and scattered office furniture covered in dust sheets. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, and there was this weird smell like old paper mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I did a quick sweep of the floor, checking behind cubicles and in the few private offices. Nothing. But as I was heading back to the elevator, I heard it again, footsteps, but this time they were coming from above me. 5th floor. This is where I probably should have called the cops or at least Mr. Rodriguez. But I was young and stupid, and honestly, I was more curious than scared at that point. I took the elevator up to the 5th floor. Same deal, empty office space, dust sheets, and that weird smell that seemed to be getting stronger. But this time, when I was halfway through my sweep, I heard the footsteps again. 6th floor. I started to realize what was happening. Whatever was making those sounds was staying 1 floor ahead of me. It was like some sick game of cat and mouse, and I was definitely the mouse. I should have left right then. I should have grabbed my stuff and walked out of that building and never looked back. But something kept me going. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I was just too freaked out to think straight. Either way, I kept following those footsteps up, floor by floor. By the time I reached the 10th floor, I was breathing hard and my hands were shaking. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. I stood there in the darkness, sweeping my flashlight beam across the empty office space, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the floor, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, facing away from me. At first, I thought it might be a mannequin or some kind of office decoration that had been left behind. But then it turned around. I can't really describe what I saw. It looked human, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, like someone had stretched a person just a little too far. Its face was pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to reflect my flashlight beam like an animal's. And when it smiled, I saw that its teeth were all wrong, too many of them, and too sharp. I ran. I don't care how that sounds, but I ran like my life depended on it. I sprinted for the elevator, hammering the button over and over until the doors finally opened. As the elevator descended, I could hear something moving in the elevator shaft above me, scratching sounds, like claws on metal. I didn't stop running until I was outside the building. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to catch my breath and figure out what the hell I'd just seen. Eventually, I convinced myself that I'd been hallucinating. Stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine, there had to be a logical explanation. But when I got home that morning, I found scratches on my arms that I couldn't remember getting. Deep ones, like claw marks. I called in sick for the next few nights, but I couldn't afford to lose the job. When I finally went back, I made sure to stick to the 1st floor. No more investigating weird noises. No more following footsteps. I'd sit at my desk, do my homework, and ignore whatever was happening in the floors above me. That worked for about a week. Then, last Tuesday night, I heard the elevator ding again. But this time, the footsteps weren't going up. They were coming down. I'm writing this from my dorm room. I quit that job 3 days ago, and I haven't slept properly since. Because here's the thing that's really messing with my head. I looked up the building's history after I quit. Turns out, about 15 years ago, a security guard working the night shift fell down the elevator shaft. They never figured out how it happened. His name was Marcus Webb, and from what I could find online, he looked exactly like the thing I saw on the 10th floor. Well, exactly like what Marcus Webb used to look like, anyway. I'm transferring to a different school next semester. Getting as far away from that building as possible. Because I have this horrible feeling that whatever's in there isn't done with me yet. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps in the hallway outside my dorm room. They stop right outside my door, and I can see a shadow moving under the crack. But when I look through the peephole, there's nothing there. I'm starting to think Marcus Webb followed me home. My name's Marcus, and this happened about 3 years ago when I was working as a long-haul trucker. I'd been driving cross-country routes for about 6 months at that point, still pretty green but confident enough to take the longer runs that paid better. The details are still crystal clear in my mind because what happened that night changed how I look at people forever. It was late October 2021, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Atlanta to Denver. I'd been driving for about 10 hours straight and was getting pretty beat, so I decided to stop for the night at this truck stop just outside Little Rock, Arkansas. The place was one of those big chain stops, you know the type, with the restaurant, showers, and a convenience store that stays open 24/7. I pulled into the truck parking area around 11 p.m. There were maybe 8 other rigs parked there, which was pretty typical for a weeknight. I grabbed my overnight bag and headed inside to pay for a shower and maybe grab some dinner before crashing in my sleeper cab. The guy working behind the counter looked like he was in his early 20s, skinny kid with sandy hair and nervous energy. His name tag said Tyler. He seemed jumpy as hell, kept glancing toward the parking lot every few seconds like he was expecting something bad to happen. When I asked about getting a shower, he practically whispered that they were out of order and had been for 2 days. That struck me as weird because I'd seen other drivers coming and going from the shower area, but I didn't push it. Sometimes these places have maintenance issues they don't advertise. I just grabbed a sandwich and a coffee and headed back to my truck. I was settling into my sleeper when I heard voices outside. Through my curtain, I could see Tyler from the store talking to 2 guys next to a beat-up sedan. Even from a distance, something about their body language seemed off. Tyler kept shaking his head, and one of the guys kept pointing back toward the store. I've always been the type to mind my own business, especially on the road. You see all kinds of weird stuff when you're trucking, and most of the time it's better to just keep moving. But something about this situation felt wrong, so I cracked my window to listen. The conversation was heated, but they were trying to keep their voices down. I caught fragments, something about the plan and just like we discussed, and nobody gets hurt if you do your part. Tyler sounded scared, saying things like I can't and this wasn't what we agreed on. That's when I realized Tyler wasn't just some nervous kid having a bad night. He was involved in something, and whatever it was going down right here at this truck stop. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the guys had walked back toward the store, and the other was moving between the parked trucks, looking into cabs. He had something in his hand, looked like a crowbar or tire iron. I ducked down below my window and tried to think. There were at least 7 other drivers sleeping in their cabs, completely unaware of what was happening. These guys were planning to rob truckers, and Tyler was helping them identify which trucks had drivers sleeping inside. The smart thing would have been to call the cops and stay hidden. But by the time police arrived, who knows how many drivers could be hurt or killed. I made a decision that probably saved lives, but it's also the reason I still have nightmares. I quietly climbed out of my cab and started moving between the trucks, trying to wake up the other drivers without alerting the guys with the weapons. The first truck I reached belonged to an older guy named Frank who I chatted with earlier. I tapped on his window until he woke up, then motioned for him to stay quiet while I explained the situation. Frank was a 20-year veteran driver, and he immediately understood the gravity of what was happening. He helped me wake up the other drivers, and within about 10 minutes, we had 7 armed truckers ready to handle the situation. Here's where things got really ugly. The 2 guys had moved closer to the trucks, and we could see they weren't alone. Tyler had let at least 4 more people into the store through the back entrance. They were wearing dark clothes and carrying various weapons, crowbars, baseball bats, and at least 1 gun that I could see. Frank made the call to 911 while the rest of us positioned ourselves strategically around the parking lot. The plan was to contain these guys until police arrived, but they spotted us before we were ready. What happened next was pure chaos. The guy with the gun started shooting, and all hell broke loose. I dove behind a tire as bullets started flying. Frank was returning fire from behind his trailer, and I could hear other drivers shouting positions and warnings. The gunfight lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the police finally arrived, 2 of the robbers were down, one was bleeding from a leg wound, and the rest had scattered into the woods behind the truck stop. Tyler was found hiding in the store's freezer, scared out of his mind and begging not to be hurt. Turns out, the robbers had been threatening his family for weeks, forcing him to help them identify targets. They'd hit 3 other truck stops in the past month, and 2 drivers had been killed. The police found evidence in the abandoned sedan that linked these guys to a string of truck stop robberies across 4 states. They'd been specifically targeting long-haul drivers because we often carry cash and valuable cargo. What really messes with my head is how close they came to pulling it off. If I hadn't been looking out my window at just the right moment, if I hadn't overheard that conversation, those guys would have systematically robbed and probably killed every driver in that parking lot. Tyler ended up cooperating with police and helped them track down the rest of the gang. Turns out, they'd been recruited online through some dark web forum that specialized in organizing robberies. They weren't just random criminals, they were part of a larger network that had been targeting truckers nationwide. I still drive long haul, but I'm a lot more careful about where I stop for the night. I carry protection now, and I always check in with other drivers when I'm at unfamiliar stops. The trucking community looks out for each other, but that night taught me just how vulnerable we really are out there. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just minded my own business and called 911 from my cab. Would those other drivers still be alive? Would the police have arrived in time? I'll never know for sure, but I do know that sometimes you have to make a choice between staying safe and doing what's right. That night in Arkansas, I chose to do what was right, and I'd make the same choice again. I've always been pretty cautious about sharing personal stuff online, but I feel like I need to get this story out there. What happened to me 2 years ago still messes with my head, and I think other people should know about it. I was living in Portland at the time, working remotely for a tech company. My lease was up, and I'd been looking for a new place for weeks. Anyone who's tried to find decent housing in Portland knows how brutal the market is. Everything's either way too expensive or a complete dump. I'd been scrolling through Craigslist for hours when I found this listing that seemed too good to be true. It was a 2-bedroom house in southeast Portland, nice neighborhood, and the rent was about $400 less than anything comparable I'd seen. The photos showed a clean, updated interior with hardwood floors and a decent kitchen. The listing had been posted by someone named David Chen. His email seemed normal enough, and when I reached out, he responded quickly. He explained that he'd inherited the house from his aunt and was renting it out while deciding whether to sell. He seemed legit, so I asked about scheduling a viewing. That's where things got weird. David said he was traveling for work and wouldn't be back for 2 weeks, but he really wanted to get the place rented quickly. He offered to mail me the keys so I could check it out myself, and if I liked it, I could move in immediately. All I had to do was send him first month's rent and a security deposit via wire transfer. I know what you're thinking. Every red flag in the book, right? But I was desperate, and the guy seemed genuine in our email exchanges. He even sent me what looked like legitimate property tax documents with his name on them. Against my better judgment, I wired him the money. 3 days later, I got a package with keys and the address. The house was exactly where he said it would be, in a quiet residential neighborhood. From the outside, it looked just like the photos. I let myself in, and everything seemed normal at first. The place was clean, recently painted, and the furniture matched what I'd seen online. But there was something off about the whole setup. The personal items were too generic, like someone had bought a bunch of stuff from IKEA and scattered it around to make the place look lived in. I moved in that weekend, and for the first few days, everything was fine. I set up my home office in the second bedroom and started settling into a routine. About a week later, I was working late when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw a middle-aged woman getting out of a Honda Civic. She walked up to the front door and started trying different keys in the lock. I opened the door before she could get in, and we both stood there staring at each other. She looked as confused as I felt. After a few awkward seconds, she asked who I was and what I was doing in her house. Turns out, her name was Linda Chen, and she was the actual owner of the property. She'd been out of town for 3 weeks visiting her daughter in California. She had no idea someone had been living in her house, and she definitely didn't have a nephew named David who was supposed to be renting the place out. Someone had been watching her house, figured out she was going to be gone for a while, and decided to rent it out to unsuspecting people like me. Linda was pretty cool about it once she realized I was a victim too, but she was also freaked out that some stranger had been scamming people using her property. We called the police, and they took a report, but the officer basically told us there wasn't much they could do. The email address David had used was probably fake, and wire transfers are almost impossible to trace. I was out almost $3,000. But here's where the story gets really messed up. The police officer mentioned that they'd been getting similar reports from other neighborhoods around the city. Someone was systematically targeting houses where the owners were away for extended periods and running this same scam. Linda let me stay in the house for a few more days while I figured out my next move, and that's when I started noticing things that really creeped me out. There were small cameras hidden in the light fixtures in the living room and bedroom. Professional-looking stuff, not the kind of thing you'd buy at Best Buy. We called the police back, and this time they took it more seriously. The cameras were still recording, which meant someone had been watching me the entire time I'd been living there. The footage was being transmitted to an external server, and the police were able to trace it back to a storage unit across town. What they found in that storage unit was beyond disturbing. There were dozens of hard drives filled with recordings from different houses around Portland. The person running this scam wasn't just stealing money from renters, they were collecting footage of people in their most private moments. The investigation led to the arrest of a guy named Marcus Webb, who turned out to be a former property manager with access to real estate databases. He'd been using his knowledge of the rental market to identify properties where owners would be away for extended periods. Then he'd break in, install cameras, and rent the places out to people like me. The really sick part was that he'd been selling the footage online. The police found evidence of payments from various websites that specialized in voyeuristic content. He'd been making money from both the fake rent payments and the violation of people's privacy. Marcus had been running this operation for over 2 years. The police estimate that he scammed more than 50 people and recorded hundreds of hours of footage. Most of his victims had no idea they'd been watched. I had to testify at his trial, which was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Sitting in that courtroom, knowing that this guy had been watching me sleep, shower, and live my daily life, was absolutely nauseating. Marcus was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, identity theft, and invasion of privacy. The judge said it was one of the most disturbing cases she'd ever seen because of the calculated nature of the crimes and the number of victims involved. I never got my money back, and I still have trust issues when it comes to rental properties. I always insist on meeting landlords in person now, and I do thorough background checks on any property I'm considering. I also sweep every new place I move into for hidden cameras, which probably makes me seem paranoid, but I don't care. If you're ever looking for a rental and something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Don't wire money to someone you've never met, and always insist on meeting the landlord in person. There are people out there who will violate your privacy in ways you can't even imagine.